is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Nutrition Sciences at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Dr. Mercer's research emphasis is on human locomotion and sport performance. In particular, Dr. Mercer has a focused line of research on biomechanical and physiological responses while running to understand factors that drive running style, influence performance, and minimize risk of overuse injury. For example, he has explored physiological and biomechanical factors by running with bodyweight support, different physiological states such as fatigue, speeds, styles, foot strike patterns, shoes, as well as in running in the water. He also has conducted research on biomechanical and physiological responses while cycling, playing lacrosse, and simulated swimming, for example. Dr. Mercer earned his BS from Buffalo State College of New York, his MS from the University of North Texas, and his PhD from the University of Oregon. He is a past president of the Southwest chapter of the American College of Sports Medicine. Dr. Mercer is the chair of the Biomedical Institutional Review Board, as well as the chair of the University Research Council. He is a world-class triathlete. He's a triathlete. As an active endurance athlete, Dr. Mercer is very engaged with the community as a participant in endurance events, as well as providing educational and research opportunities for the community members to be part of. Thank you very much, Dr. Mercer, for coming and give us a lecture. Please welcome my best friend, Dr. Mercer.
Great. Well, thank you. And yes, and we also do throwing lemons and how to catch lemons too. So thank you for coming, and it'll be fun to talk with you. And please ask any questions as we go along, and then we'll also have time at the end for more questions. So here's some different places that I've been. This is Buffalo State College. This is University of North Texas, and then University of Oregon. And I've moved around the country to do to study at different locations and with different people, and it's been a pleasure to do that, and it's a wonderful pleasure to be here. Dr. Matsumoto mentioned I do triathlons. I started back in 1985, but the first Ironman I actually came here and did Ironman Japan down in Fukuoka Island back in 2009, and so that was an excellent trip to come and see you and also do some races. So I'm from Las Vegas. Has anyone been to Las Vegas? Oh, yeah, okay. A lot of times people who think about Las Vegas think about our sign and the crazy lights and what have you of Las Vegas. It's a very interesting city. I don't do any of that, but my university is actually just down close to this area. So every day I'm down near that city, but I actually live outside the city, and this is where the craziness of Las Vegas is, and this is where I live. And I do a lot of biking out in the open desert of Las Vegas. And it's actually a beautiful area that has nothing to do with the gambling and the craziness of Las Vegas. And in fact, when we go out for different things that we do outside, we have a ski area within an hour's drive of where I live. We do cliff jumping down into the Colorado River. It's world-class rock climbing. That's actually my son jumping off a cliff here, and my other son doing rock climbing. And we have wonderful places to do bike riding, and then our very familiar Hoover Dam, which is the end of the Grand Canyon. So we have lots of opportunity for outdoor, and this is what I do more so than inside. And as I exercise outside, we actually have a lot of wildlife in Las Vegas. So this is a scorpion, and this is a scorpion with lots of little babies on the back. So there's probably about 40 baby scorpions on the mother's back right there. We have desert turtles, This is a bighorn sheep. There's one of these down here. As I'm biking along, that bighorn sheep was on the bike path. And then this is a tarantula, and that's a rattlesnake. So we see these types of critters and poison. Oh, those are my dogs too. So we'd go out and hike in the desert as well. So it's a very vibrant outside life in Las Vegas, and I've been there since 1999 and very much enjoy it. Besides our desert animals, we have a lot of great students that I've had the chance to work with. And this is just a picture of some of them. And if you have an opportunity to work in a research lab, it's really a wonderful way to learn. But these are some of the students that I've worked with over the years, and the students are really a key to a good lab. So I'm going to talk about a lot of research that I've done, but in reality, it's the students doing the work. And sometimes I'm just guiding them and working with them on their projects. So it's been a pleasure to work with them and to be able to talk about some research. So we've talked about my research focus, and a lot of times I'd call myself a biomechanist. As I was talking in the beginning, people are afraid of biomechanics because it's math and physics. And in reality, I try not to say I'm always a biomechanist. And I use this story. This is a very popular story. It's a parable. It's told in lots of different cultures. And it's a parable about an elephant. And either some teachers or some scientists are blind and they go into a room, they can't see, and they grab one part of the elephant. They don't know it's an elephant. And they're told to go into this room and to figure out what that object is in the room. So they're blind, they grab a part of it, and this scientist grabs the trunk and says, oh, this is a spear. And this scientist grabs the trunk of the, this one's grabbing the tusk, this is the trunk, and says, oh, I've got a snake. Or grabs the leg here and says, oh, it's a tree, all right? The problem that we often have, especially in exercise science, is sometimes we build these silos of information that we're too focused in one particular area, biomechanics, exercise physiology, whatever it ends up being. We'll never know that this is an elephant that we have unless the biomechanist talks to the exercise physiologist, or talks to the motor control person, or talks to the physiotherapist. We have to pull all these different messages together to try to understand, oh, we have an elephant. And so I say I'm a biomechanist, but it's not because I only do biomechanics work. I mostly say I'm a biomechanist because I tend to like equations and flowcharts. So if I get a question about, how to build more muscle, or how do I jump higher, the first thing that jumps into my head is an equation or maybe a flow chart, because I'm very mechanical in terms of that thinking or line of thought. But I'll never get to understand, in this case, an elephant, or I'll never be able to understand how to jump higher if I don't understand other areas as well. And so my research focus starts in biomechanics, but I really try to expand out from there, and I incorporate a lot of different areas to try to understand. In this case, I try to understand a lot about human locomotion. So my research focus, I use a lot of different tools in our laboratory. So I have force platforms, I use accelerometers, I measure muscle activity, and I measure kinematics as well in our lab. And then we also do a lot of exercise physiology work, so we measure that VO2 that I was talking about, how much oxygen we're using while we exercise, and we measure heart rate. And one of the areas of focus that I've gone into is using wearable technology to understand human movement. So things like GPS watches, or even like your phone, can be considered wearable technology, where we actually are recording data during movement, and then we try to use those data to understand something, whatever that something may be. So the experiments I do a lot of work where I have people run in different shoes. We use a special bodyweight support treadmill. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail right here. This is a special treadmill that we use to have people run, and that provides an upward force to make the person feel like they're lighter. We have people run in the water. We have people run with different speeds, different running styles. We have them run fatigue. So these are all different types of experiments we've run in our lab. And the reason why we do a lot of these experiments is I want to try to understand endurance performance better. But I've got to be careful. I'm interested in endurance performance not only to just run faster. Did anyone happen to watch that group of runners that tried to break 2 hours in the marathon? That was a pretty big deal, where a group of runners worked with Nike, who makes shoes, and they were trying to get under 2 hours in the marathon, which is incredibly fast, and no one's ever gone under 2 hours before. And that's an important area of work. But the work I do is not only with elite athletes. I'm mostly interested in mere mortals, like people like me, or people maybe like here in this room, who may want to run a marathon in 5 hours versus trying to do it in under 2 hours. My research focus is also on trying to help people run further, maybe to complete an event versus compete in an event. So being able to do an iron distance race. And a lot of my work is also on trying to prevent injury. We know if we take a group of people who start running and training for a marathon, that probably 75 of them out of 100 will start having some type of injury. And probably 25 of them will have to stop running because of some injury. And so we try to do research to try to understand what do they need to do to prevent those injuries, or what do they need to do to rehabilitate those injuries so they can start running again. So this is my applied research, but then sometimes I just like to ask interesting questions. And so it's much more theoretical, and it may not have an application, and that's okay. So research has lots of different purposes behind it. Sometimes it's to come up with answers, and sometimes it's just to ask interesting questions for the sake of asking. So I always enjoy coming and visiting Dr. Matsumoto, because we will often just be driving around or sitting and eating and just start asking interesting questions that have no application, and it's very fun. But the question I'll talk about here is this question that I like to ask is, why do we run the way we run? So if we get up from here, we go outside, and we run across campus, we're going to each pick a particular running style. Why do we pick the running style we use? And here's what's really neat. Like if you see your friend from a distance, maybe 100 meters off, you may not be able to recognize the face of the person, but you can say, oh, that's my friend, because he or she is running a particular way. So it's interesting that we can pick out unique aspects of our movement based upon how we move, and that it's very unique to us. But I ask this question in my class a lot, and I say, why do we run the way we run? And sometimes we compare humans to how other animals run. And sometimes it's easy to identify bad running form. But when I start, trying to tease out an answer to why we run the way we run, we start using terms like, well, maybe it has something to do with economy or efficiency or speed. Maybe it has to do with preventing fatigue or exhaustion. Maybe it has to do with morphology, how we're built. Or maybe it has to do with motor program, how our brain is working, or what have you. Or maybe it's even we're trying to avoid injuries. And lots of other reasons that try to get to this answer of why do we run the way we run. This is my main question I'll talk about today. When I teach this in class, I often play this video. And I'll say, okay, let's look at Usain Bolt running. Why is Usain Bolt running a particular way when the fastest runner in the world, for 100 meters? And in a class, I would actually start having students trying to answer why does he run the way he runs compared to this person, compared to this person. And then I'll compare and contrast that to this runner. This is Ryan Hall running the Boston Marathon. So running 26.2 or 42 kilometers versus 100 meters. So our running style, if we start trying to compare his running style to Usain Bolt's running style, they would be very different. Or there would be some similarities as well. So why is one good, or why is one good at 100 meters and one good for 42.2 meters? Well, we could start looking at, what's similar and what's different. We could look at trunk angle, we could look at foot strike, we could look at the arm movements, what shoes people are wearing in this race versus this race, stride frequency. We can look at all these different parts of running to start to try to figure out what's the best way to run 100 meters and what's the best way to run 42.2 kilometers. All right, so why they run the way they run is partly because of the event they're doing. And so these are running styles that we probably want to try to mimic or to emulate. Like I would love to be able to run like Ryan Hall, or I wish I could run as fast or like Usain Bolt. Okay, those are good running styles. Well, here's what's interesting, is here's New York Marathon back in 2011. And what's really interesting, this is the women's, she's winning the women's New York Marathon, and she's going to do it in under 2.5 hours. Incredibly fast, all right? Piece got Jeep too. So, but if you look at her running style, very unique running style. Do I want to run like her? Right? I would love to run 2.5 hours in a marathon. I can't run 2.5 hour marathon. She's much faster than me. But you can see her running style is very unique in terms of how her leg is doing. And this is the way that she runs. And it works for her. It's 2.5 hour marathon. It's fabulous. Okay. So why does Usain Bolt run the way he runs? Why does Ryan Hall run the way he runs? Why does Jito run the way she runs? It has to do a little bit more than just perfect styles. So there's lots of different factors that influence the running style. In Jito's case, she's built a particular way, and that drives her running style. Well, running style is also influenced by a number of other factors. Sometimes it's motivation, all right? Has anyone been chased by a hippopotamus? I have not, but yeah. Motivation, maybe it's temperature or even running on sand. Maybe it's external forces like somebody pushing on someone or trying to tackle them, or maybe trying to carry an object, or running on different surfaces like on trails or in mud. All these different situations require a little different change in running style. Well, here's the other interesting thing is our ability to run is based upon how I was talking about catching a lemon earlier. It's based upon our ability to perceive the environment. So we have to, when we're running, we take in sensory information. I take in visual information. I take in auditory information. I take in kinesthetic sense, which is where my limbs are located. I can sense that. I take in all this sensory information. Then what do? I predict things about the environment. So I predict how stable the surface is, or how slippery or not slippery the surface is. Then what do? Then I execute a particular movement. My brain tells the lower extremity muscles to fire in a particular way to put the foot out in a particular spot to be able to put the foot down so it doesn't slip out from underneath me. Then I execute that. I coordinate all the muscles, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, all the muscle fibers within there. I tell this muscle to fire, then that muscle in a particular pattern. And then what do? Then I adjust this pattern over and over and over again. So if I go for a 30-minute run, I have 5,000 foot contacts. So I'm doing this over and over and over and over again. My brain is taking in information, telling muscles to contract a particular way. I hit the ground, and my brain says, okay, that was good. Oh, no, that was bad. Okay, let's adjust that a little bit. All right. And I do this constantly for 5,000 meters. So running on this type of situation, his perception is closer to his feet because he's trying to perceive his environment, which is changing a lot. But here, running on track, which is very predictable, perception doesn't, he makes assumptions about his environment. It's very safe. All right? I can move around, I can run in a particular way. I don't have to worry about rocks, or I don't have to worry about dirt slipping out. And as long as this environment prediction is correct, I've run successfully. And if I make an error in prediction, or this all of a sudden becomes slippery, maybe that's where I slip, or maybe I trip, or what have you. So running is really quite a complex task that has to go over, we have to do it over and over and over again. And the other part that's important in looking at running is, what is the goal of running? Are we trying to run faster? Are we trying to run 100 meters? Or are we trying to run 42.2 kilometers? Or are we just trying to run for distance, to run 5K for fun? Are we doing it for exercise? Are we competing? Or is it just going out for a therapeutic run to relieve some stress or what have you? Every time we run, we have a goal, and that goal, our running pattern, is solution to the problem. So if I'm trying to run 100 meters, I'm going to pick a running style that is a solution to running 100 meters as fast as possible. So running is a very complex pattern, and so trying to answer this question, why do we run the way we run, we actually have to give it a little bit of context. And our context is the work that we do is we're interested in if we just go for a run across campus, and we're not necessarily competing in a race, but we're just going to go for a run. All right? And often we'll use the instructions, we're going to run for somewhat hard intensity. Well, when we run that way, then we use this as a theory. Chris Vaughan put this article out, and he's had a number of different theories for locomotion. This is one of them. And in this theory of locomotion, we say that locomotion is the translation of the center of gravity along a pathway requiring the least energy expenditure, or expenditure of energy, or the least calories. So if I run for 5 kilometers, I pick a running style that's going to use the least amount of calories to cover that 5 kilometers. That's what this theory states. And the way, that's too complicated for me. So what I just say is humans are inherently lazy. We find the easiest way to run. We find the easiest way to use the least amount of calories or the least amount of oxygen to run a particular distance. So we're lazy. Now that's probably not the case for these two, okay? He's simply trying to run as fast as possible. He doesn't care how much energy he uses. He's trying to cover a distance as fast as possible. And same thing with Ryan Hall. He's running at a very different type of style that may not optimize or require the least amount of energy expenditure. So that's where we've got to keep this in mind, that this question, why do we run the way we run, gets complicated really fast if we don't put some context. So I'm interested in just going for a nice, peaceful run, okay, as opposed to trying to run 100 meters in world class or for 42.2K in under 2 hours. So here's the instructions that we often use in a lot of our experiments. And this is important to keep in mind as I start talking about running results. We tell people to pick a speed you feel you could sustain for about 30 minutes.
Okay, whatever you want to
So just pick that speed. And then once we have that speed, what we do is we manipulate speed, how fast they're running. Maybe we have them run in different shoes. Maybe we change the surface they're running on. We have them run with longer strides, or maybe we change the environment, or maybe we introduce fatigue, and then we start looking for how people respond. So that's our experiments that we set up. So looking at this question in a little bit more detail, why do we run the way we run? The why part of this question is a strategy. Why are we doing something a particular way? And the goal of the task is important. The way we run is what we measure in the lab. So we measure muscle activity. We measure energetic cost and locomotion. We measure kinematics, what the movement looks like. Or we measure kinetics, what the forces involved with movement are like. And this is my little model of running that I talked about a little bit earlier. We take chemical energy and we transform that chemical energy to mechanical energy. This is what allows us to move. This is our fats and carbohydrates in the body. And then we use aerobic and anaerobic systems to convert energy from chemical state to mechanical state. And so we use a lot of exercise physiology, looking at energy systems, and then we use a lot of biomechanics, looking at movement, kinematics, we're looking at forces, and we look at muscle activity during running. So let me give you some biomechanic terms to describe running. So basic kinematic descriptors of running are stride length and stride frequency. Stride length is just how far we cover with one stride. So left foot to left foot, just that distance, the length of that yellow line. Stride frequency is how fast we're taking steps. So how the time from this moment to this moment. Okay, so same side to same side. So left to left, right to right, whichever it is. So stride length, how far we cover the distance with one stride, and stride frequency, how quickly we're covering those strides. Velocity is how fast we're running, and that's the product of stride length and stride frequency. So if we know stride length, we know how fast the strides are happening, we know how fast the person's running. So our experiments that I'm going to talk about today are built around manipulating one of these parameters, or maybe I control a parameter and I introduced some perturbation or some change in the system. So a perturbation would be to run in different shoes, or to run in the water and run on the treadmill, or to run with bodyweight support, or run with fatigue, or run with different speeds. So we change these things, and then we look for how they respond, with this being a description of a running strategy. So the 3 areas that I'll talk about will be these areas. I'll talk about how stride length, stride frequency, and velocity change with each other, and I'll look at running on a treadmill versus running over ground. Then I'll talk a little bit about VO2 and some different areas, and then I'll talk a little bit about biomechanics, some impact forces, and then I'll talk about some situations where stride frequency and stride length change. All right, so this is some very typical data that we see if you open up a textbook on biomechanics. This is very characteristic. This is stride rate on this axis, and that goes along with this line of data here. This is stride length on this axis, and that goes along with these data right here. And then this is running velocity right here. So stride length, stride rate, and velocity. So what does this tell us? This tells us that as we're running faster, our stride length will plateau at faster velocities. But our faster velocities we reach by having faster stride rates, but our stride length only gets so long. So plateaus. It gets to be a constant, and then if we want to run faster, we simply need to take faster strides. And these are classic data back in 1973, and this is out there, and there's a lot of good information that supports that. These are just a bunch of different studies. All these are different studies. This is stride length or stride rate over here, and then this is velocity here. And there's a lot of data that look just like the previous slide. So in general, consistent description of the relationship between stride length, stride frequency, and velocity. However, what's interesting is we were looking at these studies a little bit carefully, and if I take the studies that were done while people run over ground, so running across the ground here, versus running on the treadmill, we started to see some differences. That when you run over ground, you start to see that plateau in stride length. So you're running faster, your stride length tends to plateau. But running on the treadmill, when I looked at all the studies that were out there, none of those studies showed a plateau in stride length. So interesting question. Working in a research lab, I said, well, let's test this out. Let's have people run at different velocities on the treadmill, and then also do it over ground. And then let's look at their stride length and stride rate. And we did that study, and these are the data from that study. These dots are all representing different people running different velocities. So this is stride length versus velocity, and stride rate or stride frequency versus velocity here. The blue are when people were running over ground, and the red are when they were running on the treadmill. So this is stride length, and this is stride rate. Here's the blue that looks just like the classic data that stride length tends to plateau as we run faster. But on the treadmill, stride length did not plateau. So people were running faster, and stride length just kept getting longer and longer and longer. So we asked ourselves, why is that? Well, so first we identified that the strategy to run faster on the treadmill is different than if they run over ground. So on the treadmill, you keep taking longer and longer strides. When running over ground, you have to increase stride rate to run faster. All right? So back to our hypothesis, humans are inherently lazy. What we think actually is going on is on the treadmill, everyone figured out really quickly to run faster on the treadmill, you just have to jump up and the treadmill moves underneath you. And then you land and then you jump up again and the treadmill moves underneath you. So they figured out a very lazy way to run faster was to simply lengthen their stride by jumping higher on the treadmill. I actually need to go back and actually test that and measure the height that they're jumping when running on the treadmill versus over ground. But we were able to identify that faster velocities are achieved differently, different strategy on the treadmill versus over ground. And again, we just naturally adapt to that when we're running. So why is that? Well, now what I'll do is I'll switch over to physiology. So what is the relationship between velocity and VO2 when you run on the treadmill and run over ground? And so these are not, this is just some basic data. This is what I was talking about before we started. This is oxygen consumption over here on this axis and velocity here. And these are all different data points from a lot of different people. And in general, as we run faster, rate of oxygen consumption increases. Okay? So this is just running on a treadmill. VO2 increases with velocity. These are some data. These aren't mine. These are back from the mid-90s. This is treadmill versus over ground. These are different lines here representing running on the treadmill for these lines, and this is running on track. So this is the line running on track. This is running at 0% grade, 1%, 2%, and 3%. And so what these folks were able to determine was that we used the same amount of oxygen running over ground versus on a treadmill when the treadmill was set to at least a 1% and maybe a 2% grade. So if you want to use the same calories running over ground and on the treadmill, you have to set the treadmill up to a little incline. But if it's a level treadmill, compared to road, this is a level treadmill, we used less oxygen while running on a level treadmill versus running over ground. So this goes back to the idea that we run differently when running on the treadmill versus over ground. Switched over to here. So why do you run the way you run? This is our first sort of answer to the question. Well, first of all, to answer that question, we need to know, are you running on a treadmill or are you running over ground? Because the answer to this question is going to be dependent on if you're on a treadmill or on running over ground. And then we also have to know what velocity you're running, because you're going to run differently depending on if you're running slower or faster. So now what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what's the relationship between stride length, stride frequency, and VO2. So when you run, you pick a particular stride frequency and a particular stride length. So now I'm going to talk about how much oxygen you consume while running a particular speed. So let's say you came to my lab and I hooked you up to this special machine that measured how much air you breathe in and exhale. And that's what I'm going to put here is volume of oxygen consumption. And then I'm going to have you just run. And when you run on the treadmill, you're just going to naturally pick a particular stride rate and stride length for that speed. You're just going to naturally pick it. And we call that the preferred stride length and preferred stride frequency. We can measure that, we can quantify it, and I'm just going to put a little red dot right here indicating this is the amount of oxygen that you consume when running at the preferred stride length and preferred stride frequency. That's how much it is. Now you're running on this treadmill, you're still breathing the air in, and we're measuring that, and then I tell you to use a faster stride rate. Okay, so faster strides, shorter stride length. Okay, what happens to the amount of oxygen you use? It actually goes up. It actually is harder. So if you go out and you start running, rather than run the way you want to run, start taking faster strides, the cost of running goes up. It gets harder. All right? And then if we tell people to take even shorter strides or faster strides, the amount of oxygen consumed goes even higher. So it just keeps going up. Likewise, if we say take slower strides but longer ones, the amount of oxygen that you consume will also go up. And so what we do is we look at this relationship between stride length and oxygen consumption, that we tend to pick a stride length and stride rate that is the lowest amount of oxygen consumed. Any other running style means more VO2. So it goes back to this idea that we're inherently lazy and we're finding a running style that results in the least amount of energy expenditure. And there's some good data. These are data back from 1982 demonstrating just that. Here's VO2 here. This is stride length down here. And in general, as this runner took longer strides further out on this, the amount of oxygen consumed went up. As the runner took shorter strides, the amount of oxygen also went up. So it got harder in each of those cases. Well, that's interesting, but it supports this idea that humans are inherently lazy, that we're picking a stride length or stride rate that results in the least amount of energy consumed. Well, what happens when you start changing velocity? Because this is at one velocity. Well, we actually did that study where we measured VO2, and we have stride frequency down here. And we did that same experiment while running at 3.13 meters per second. And this is the preferred condition, so we call that 100%. And then we had them run with a faster stride frequency, and VO2 goes up just a little bit. And then we had them run with a slower stride frequency, and VO2 goes up. So that was running at 3.13 meters per second. Then we had them run faster. We saw about the same type of thing. So a little bit faster, more oxygen consumed here. Faster stride rate, oxygen goes up a little bit. And then we had them run even faster. And maybe you can see it now, but as speed increased, this U-shaped type of phenomena actually starts to flatten out as we run faster. So the VO2 became more similar the faster we ran. And so out of this, what we took is as we ran faster, it was more important to stay closer to that preferred stride frequency, but as we were running slower, we have more options. So right now, it's not going to make much difference if I change my stride rate or stride length in VO2. But if I'm trying to run as fast as possible, I need to be as close to that stride frequency that I naturally want to select. Any small changes actually make it really hard to continue to exercise. So preferred stride frequency became even more important as we run faster. So why do we run the way we run? Well, first of all, we like to use this as a general statement that we do try to minimize the energetic cost of locomotion. We try to make it as easy as possible. But there's lots of room for changes in running style. In fact, some of the data that I showed is that you can change stride length plus or minus 5%, maybe even 10%, and not negatively influence how hard the exercise is. So we are searching for another answer for why we run the way we run besides just VO2. And so let me talk a little bit about biomechanics here. So in our lab, we also measure ground reaction forces. We have people run across a special force platform that measures how hard we push on the ground. And when we do that, we get data that looks just like this. This is the amount of force exerted on the ground, and this is how long the foot is in contact with the ground. This is the moment the foot strikes the ground, and this is the moment the foot leaves the ground. So ground contact and toe off. So the foot's only in contact with the ground with less than a quarter of a second as you're running. So the foot's in contact with the ground just a short period of time. And what we do, we look a lot at this first force right here, which is in this case 1,500 newtons. This runner probably weighs about 1,000 newtons. And we often see this impact force is 1.5 times body weight. So however much you weigh when you're running, every time you hit the ground, it's probably 1.5 times higher than that. So if I weigh 800 newtons, 1.5 times that is 800, 1,200 newtons. So it's a lot. And remember, we do 5,000 impacts for a 30-minute run. So we often look a lot at this because when we're looking at running, we have to absorb that impact. Do you ever walk around and accidentally miss a step and not flex your knee when you hit the ground? You hit the ground and there's a shock wave of energy that's sent up through your body. We measure that. We try to get a sense of what happens if you don't attenuate that impact peak. We think it actually leads to injury. So what we do in our lab, we've done a lot of work with looking at factors that influence the impact force. If you run faster, the impact force goes up. If you take a longer stride, the impact force goes up. If you run on gets a little tricky. If you run on a stiffer surface, sometimes the impact force goes up. Sometimes it actually goes down too. Because if we know we're running on a hard surface, we actually will change the way we run to make it easier on the body. We know running uphill influences the impact force. Running downhill, this goes up. And also the way the leg hits the ground is important with determining that impact force. So these are just some different data from running at different velocities. So this is ground reaction force over here in multiples of body weight, and this is running 3 different speeds. So slower, medium speed, and then a fast speed. And so this is very characteristic. This is slower, and the red is faster. So as we run faster, the foot's in contact with the ground for a shorter period of time. And as we run faster, that impact peak goes up. This is very characteristic of what we see in running. And these are just a whole bunch of different data points of different runners. And this is just looking at that impact force. So just that first peak that I showed and different velocities. And in general, as we run faster, that impact goes up. And that impact we think is related to injuries. And so a lot of what we do with looking at running style, maybe we're looking at running shoes, maybe we're looking at running surfaces, we're actually trying to bring this impact peak down. So, so as I introduced before, as we run faster, we're also taking longer strides. So at this point, we asked the question, is the impact force going up because I'm running faster, or is it going up because I'm taking longer strides? So we actually ran an experiment on that, and we did this experiment. Let me just explain it, and then I'll show you the data. This is stride length right here, and this is running velocity here. And we had people running across our lab, so running across the ground. And what we did, in one set of conditions, we just told the people to run slow and run faster and faster and faster. So they ran like 40 times in our lab. And as they ran faster, they took longer strides. That's this line right here. Okay. So faster velocities, stride length went up. This goes back to the first slides that I showed. That's very characteristic. Then what we did is we put marks on the floor, and we had them hit specific lengths of stride, and the stride was 2.5 meters long. And so that's what this line represents. So they ran faster, but they still only ran with 2.5 meter stride. So to run faster, they have to take a faster stride rate. So it's like hitting the red marks on this carpet here. No matter how fast you run, you've got to hit those red marks. So sometimes you take long, slow strides, and sometimes you have to be really fast. But no matter what, it's always 2.5 meters. But normally, if I'm running faster, I'm going to take a longer stride. So then what we did is we put a force platform at one of those marks, and then we measured how much impact force there was. This is a little complicated slide, but this is impact force right here. This is the same velocities, and this black line represents the increase in impact force, and that's when they were allowed to freely select their stride length. So you give no instructions, they're going to run faster and faster, and as they run faster, the impact force went up. But when we told them to hit these red marks on the ground, and they ran faster, the impact force was the same. It didn't change. All right? So by controlling stride length, the amount of impact force was set regardless of how fast they were running. So this was an important observation, because now we were able to say that they were not running the way they were running to minimize impact force, because they could have chosen a running style at this speed that reduced the impact force by taking shorter strides, but they didn't do that. They ran faster and they let impact go up naturally. So we ruled this out, that they were not trying to minimize impact peak for choosing a particular running style. And what we also identified is that the amount of impact is really a function of how the leg is hitting the ground versus even how fast we're running. So then with Dr. Matsumoto's work that we've worked on together quite a bit, we were interested in what happens when you start providing body weight support to somebody running. All right? And we do body weight support using two different techniques. One, we put the person in the water, and they're not touching the ground. And Dr. Matsumoto's also done a lot of work with shallow water locomotion. I'll just talk about the deep water part now. But in deep water, they do not touch the bottom of the pool. And then we also use this treadmill, which is about $200,000 treadmill. So how many yen? It's 200,000 yen treadmill, where what this does is it pressurizes the inside of this treadmill and lifts the person up while they run. So they can run at 10% less body weight, 20% less body weight, 50% less body weight, or even they can run at 20% of their body weight. So it's a way to make them easy. So this is something that's used a lot in physical therapy for rehabilitating runners, is they're able to run at a lighter weight, and they're able to run without pain. So we've done a lot of work on this. I'm going to focus only in on some of the stride rate data that we have. So here's stride frequency here. This is rating of perceived exertion. I can't put velocity down here because I'm not touching the bottom of the pool here, so the forward movement of the runner is not important here. So what we've had to actually spend a lot of time on is how to compare running in the water, deep water running, to running on land. And often we manipulate how hard the exercise feels. So this is some of the work that we've done together. This is treadmill running data here for stride frequency, and this is running in the water. You can see easily when you run in the water, for a given intensity, you use a slower stride rate. So we put someone in the water, we tell them exercise somewhat hard, they're going to pick a stride rate that's much lower in the water than running on land. We say exercise harder, they're going to pick a stride rate that's lower in the water than on land. Very easy. Okay. Well, that's likely due, obviously, to the hydrostatic forces in the water. But this is also what we've done a lot of work on, and we've looked at how active muscles are while running in the water. So the black lines are running on land, the red lines are running in the water. This is the quadriceps, the front part of the quadriceps, the rectus femoris. This is the biceps femoris. This is the tibialis anterior. This is the front part of the leg, and the gastrocnemius, or the back part of the leg. And this is the beginning of a stride, and this is the end of a stride. And this is how active the muscles are. So we put sensors on the muscles, and we figure out how much electrical activity is going on in the muscles, and we can see when a muscle is really active or when it's not very active at all. And so all the black lines are data when we had people running on the treadmill, and all the red lines are when they're running on or running in the water. And what we did was we manipulated how fast their strides were. And without going into too much detail, you can see that running in the water, this red line, results in a very different muscle activity pattern than running on a treadmill. So you put someone in the water, they use a different stride rate, and they're using muscles differently in the water. All right. So muscle activity magnitude we saw was lower in the water when running on lower in the water versus running on the treadmill. The patterns are also different. The coordination between muscles is also different. But here's what's really weird, and this is actually a different question, but it's also a question that we're really interested in. When runners use running in the water, they can still train for on-land running performance. So there's something about running in the water that allows someone to run faster on land, which is really weird, and we don't know why that is, but that's something that we've been working on. So how is stride frequency and stride length and muscle activity influenced by body weight support without the drag forces? So clearly, putting someone in the water, you have to push harder against the water. That's clearly something that's influencing the running style. Well, that's where we put someone in this special treadmill. There's no resistance to the lower extremity, and we look at how they run with body weight support. So here's some data that we did. This is percent of preferred speed, so they just get in the treadmill and they run with either no support or with different levels of body weight support. So this is 80% body weight support, meaning this is pushing up with 80% force, so they only weigh 20% of their weight. And then in this study, we looked at how long the stride was for these different speeds. And again, just as I've already talked a few times, as we run faster, stride length increased. Well, here, as we increased body weight support, stride length also increased. So they took a slower stride. So body weight support, they're taking a longer stride and slower. Right? So more body weight support, they are just naturally taking a slower stride, which is really sort of interesting. And it's automatic. You go into this treadmill and it just happens. No one has to tell the people what to do. It just changes very quickly. So preferred stride frequency is lower while running with body weight support here, as well as with running in the water. All right. So that's an actually really important observation that we're trying to figure out why that is. Well, here, this is just EMG. This is muscle activity. So same type of data here. This is 20% body weight, 30%, 40%. This is different conditions in that treadmill. This is how active muscles are, and then each one of these is a speed. And without getting into too much of the detail, the amount of muscle activity goes down with increasing body weight support. So when I weigh only 20% my body weight, my muscles are much less active. So if I lose a lot of weight, my muscles would have to be less active. That's partly what this tells us. But as we run faster, muscle activity goes up for each body weight support. So that was an important part of this study as well. So muscle activity magnitudes are different while running with different body weight support levels, but the patterns, and I didn't show them here, the patterns are almost exactly the same. So the coordination of muscles is very similar when running on this type of treadmill versus running in the water. But preferred stride frequency and stride length changes automatically as we start introducing different body weight supports. Why is that? Why does preferred stride frequency and stride length change easily with body weight support, but hard to change when we're just running? So something I didn't mention earlier, but when we do this type of work and we start telling people to run with different stride frequencies, it's really hard to have them change the way they want to run. In fact, when we do this work and we say, okay, run with a faster stride rate, we have to constantly remind them, no, keep going faster, keep going faster, keep going faster, because they want to keep coming back to the style that they naturally want to run with. All right, and that's what's really weird. But we put them in this treadmill and they change stride rate automatically. So there's something really interesting going on here, and we don't quite have the answer to that. And actually, that's what we spent my visit here is actually talking quite a bit about why that might be, why it's easy to change stride rate in this situation where we add body weight support, but when we tell people to change the way they run, it's very hard. But we do know that this is not a fixed amount. we know that preferred stride frequency and stride length is not a set amount. It's very easy to change it if we add body weight support, or maybe we have them run in different weird shoes, or sometimes even if we're telling people to carry things, they'll change the way they run very quickly. So we look at all these different aspects of running, and each of them stride length and stride rate change very quickly. So why do we run the way we run? Well, I'm going to try to get to an answer, and I won't be able to answer the question. Well, we know running style changes when there's physiological changes. When we start fatiguing, at the end of a marathon versus the beginning of the marathon, we're going to be running differently. When surfaces change, or when the environment changes, which is what I've talked about quite a bit here. We also know VO2 and impact forces change when we change shoes, when we run on the treadmill versus running over ground, when we run at different speeds or even different styles of running. So I'm going to try to pull all those different data points together and give an idea as to why we run the way we run. This is VO2 in the red. That's that U-shaped phenomena that if you just start running, you're going to pick a speed right around here, and the impact keeps going up if you take a longer stride or you start deviating from that stride pattern you want. And what we think is going on is there's a region in around that preferred stride range that oxygen cost is minimized and impact is not necessarily bad. But if we deviate outside that region, our oxygen cost goes up and our impact can either go down or it can go up. But this is a two-dimensional model. What Dr. Matsumoto and I have been working on is trying to incorporate how active muscles are in this. And so maybe what there really is a third dimension to this plot that comes out of this board, and then it has to do with how active muscles are. And so that's what we've been trying to pull together, the data from different studies to try to identify that. So why do you run the way you run? Well, again, I'm a biomechanist, so I think equations. Well, we need to take all these factors into mind. Morphology, our structure is, our physiology, our mechanics, our environment. We need to understand the goal of the task. We've got to understand the experience and the skill of the person. We add those all up, and we get whatever that running style is. And we do that in a process of perception, prediction. We have to execute the movement, and then we have to adjust, and we do this over and over and over and over again for running. So 5,000 times in 30 minutes. Now, there's all sorts of technology that are available nowadays to start trying to track running style. And this is what's really interesting. And we're looking at the influence of some of these algorithms to understand the running. So even wearing a watch that tracks how you run. This is a really interesting area of research right now. And I think the way the wearable technology is going is the technology is going to have to measure core temperature, blood glucose, heart rate, oxygen consumption, environmental conditions, muscle activity or accelerometers, muscle activity, and all of that information can go into wearable technology. We're getting closer and closer to that to understand running style a little bit more. And ultimately, to be able to understand the way we run, we need to have an algorithm that's going to look something like this. All right? This is an algorithm that's actually on how to generate a name of your son or daughter. So it's very complicated. Running to try to incorporate all this information to understand running style is very complicated, and it's going to require a pretty complex algorithm. What I often end with when I talk about why we run the way we run, a lot of people want to know the answer to that because they really want to know the answer to this question, is what shoe should I buy? All right? When people come into my lab and we have this discussion, I often have to apologize that we can't tell any one person which shoe they should buy to prevent a running injury. And that's because of all the things I presented in this slideshow and more. It's a very complex process. That my running style is partly unique to me because of the way I'm built. It's partly because of my experience, It's partly due to my ability to perceive the environment, make predictions about what I need to, how I need to move, and my ability to actually recruit muscles. So my shoe, the shoe that works for me, is going to be very different than the shoe for any of you as well. What we try to do is do research to try to narrow down what shoe may be right for one person versus another person. But it's a very complex process to ultimately to determine what shoe works for somebody. So thank you for listening to this presentation. These are some pictures from Dr. Masumoto, myself, over a number of different years. This is the lab that we actually did quite a bit of work in, and he continues to come back each year. And some of our pictures of our families that we enjoy getting together. So thank you, and I'll be glad to take any questions.